Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a file that feels a bit like an episode of CSI Ancient America.
It really does, yeah.
We're doing a forensic comparison between the descriptions of life in the Book of Mormon and the hard physical realities of Mesoamerica. So that's southern Mexico and northern Central America.
Right, and it's a fascinating overlay to look at. Usually, when people approach the source material, they do it entirely from a theological perspective,
Yeah.
looking for doctrine.
Sure.
But today, our mission is different. We aren't here to prove the book religiously for you. We're here to see if the cultural puzzle pieces actually fit when we look closer at the anthropology and the science.
I love that approach. It feels less like Sunday school and more like like a detective story.
Right.
But before we get into the cool matches, we have to address the elephant in the room right off the bat. Or I guess the horse in the room.
Right, you mean the traditional deal breakers.
Exactly. Because for a long time, there's been these massive red flags for critics. The text mentions things like steel swords and horses, silk herds of cattle. And if you've watched any documentaries, you learn that in ancient America, those things supposedly just didn't exist.
That is the standard anachronism argument. And honestly, it's a logical starting point. I mean, if a history book said George Washington texted his troops on an iPhone, you'd throw the book out.
Yeah, you'd assume it's fake.
Right. So the argument is that mentioning steel in 500 BC Mesoamerica is the equivalent of that iPhone.
Yay.
It places a technology in a time where it doesn't belong.
But the source material we are working through today suggests that the goalposts on what did and didn't exist are actually moving.
They're moving quite a bit, actually. The source material takes a really fascinating approach. Instead of just looking at geography, it looks at the cultural medium. How did these people actually live? What was their technology really made of?
Okay.
And when you look at that layer, those deal breakers start to look a lot more like missing data points that are slowly being filled in.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this. Let's start with the hardest substance first, which is metal. I think most of us were taught that ancient Americans were strictly Stone Age people until the Europeans showed up with their armor.
That has been the orthodox archaeological view for a long time. It's often called the AD 900 barrier. The idea was that metallurgy didn't appear in Mesoamerica until AD 900.
And since the Book of Mormon timeline ends around AD 400, the timelines just don't touch.
Right. So if that barrier holds up, the text is historically impossible. But here is where it gets really interesting. That barrier has essentially been broken. We now have physical evidence of metal use much, much earlier.
Give me the evidence. What exactly are we finding?
Well, for one, there is a piece of copper sheathing found on an altar at Cuicuilco, down in the Valley of Mexico. That dates back to the 1st century BC.
1st century BC.
Yes, that puts it right in the middle of the Book of Mormon timeline.
So metal existed 1,000 years earlier than the textbooks claimed.
In that specific instance, yes. And we have to look at the bigger picture, too. We know metalworking existed in Peru and Ecuador as far back as 1900 BC. And we know for a fact that there were trade routes connecting South America to Mexico.
Oh, okay. So the logic is if they were trading pottery and shells, they probably didn't just leave the metal technology behind.
Precisely. It would be like trading smartphones but leaving the chargers at home. It's totally illogical to think that technology didn't travel with the trade. But what is even more compelling to me is the linguistic evidence. This is where we get into the fossils of language.
I love this concept. It's like archaeology, but for words. How does that work?
So historical linguists have reconstructed proto-languages, the ancestors of modern indigenous languages.
Yeah.
They found that Proto-Mixtecan, Proto-Mayan, and Proto-Mixoquian, which is likely the language of the Olmecs, they all had words for metal as far back as 1500 BC.
Wait, so even if we haven't found the physical factories, the people had a word for the stuff 3,000 years ago?
Yes. You generally don't have a word for something that doesn't exist in your world. And there's a specific linguistic link that's quite startling. The Maya word for gold is nab. There's a parallel to the Egyptian word for gold, which is naub.
Nab and naub. That is suspiciously close.
It gets closer. The Zaquian word for copper is hamatin. The Egyptian word is kiti.
Wow. That suggests some kind of link, or at least a very old shared origin. But let's talk about the specific metals mentioned in the text, because it doesn't just say metal, it gets specific. It says brass. Now, when I hear brass, I think of a saxophone.
Right, because modern brass is a zinc-copper alloy. And for a long time, scholars said ancient Americans didn't have zinc alloys. But we have to remember the translation process. The Book of Mormon uses the language of the King James Bible. And in the Bible, brass often referred to bronze.
So it's just a translation issue?
Partly, but here's a twist. Recent testing on Etruscan artifacts shows they actually did use a zinc alloy true brass around the time of Lehi, so it is technically possible. But in a Mesoamerican context, brass might refer to a high-quality bronze or another local alloy.
What about iron?
Iron is fascinating because the Olmecs used iron minerals like hematite and magnetite to make mirrors and compasses. Also, the Aztecs absolutely knew about meteoric iron. They called it metal from heaven.
Okay, what about the weird ones? There's a metal mentioned in the text called ziph, which, to be honest, sounds like a cleaning product, but it's listed as precious.
Ziph is a really unique term. The source suggests it likely refers to tumbaga.
Tumbaga. I've never heard of that. Break that down for me. What is it?
It is a brilliant piece of ancient chemistry. Tumbaga is a gold-copper alloy. Imagine you mix gold and copper. It looks reddish like copper. But the ancient smiths figured out that if you treat the surface with an acid like citric acid from local plants, it eats away the copper atoms on the surface but leaves the gold atoms behind.
Oh, so it's like self-plating?
Essentially, yes. It creates a shiny, pure gold surface on an object that is mostly copper. It looks like gold, but it's lighter and harder. Now, looking at the linguistics, the Hebrew root for ziph can mean shining or plated. That fits Tumbaga perfectly.
That is wild. Okay, what about the big one? Steel. The text mentions steel swords. That feels very medieval to me, like King Arthur stuff.
Steel is definitely the most difficult translation to reconcile with our modern image. In the Old World, the word translated as steel in the King James Bible often meant hardened bronze. But here's a surprise. Even the Spanish chroniclers, when they arrived in the 1500s, described the helmets of the Tarascan people, who were great metallurgists, by the way, as being made of steel.
So the Spanish called it steel even if it wasn't modern steel.
Exactly. The Tarascans had created a hardened copper or bronze alloy that was tough enough to deflect blows. So the Spanish, seeing its function, called it acero, which is steel.
So when we see steel in the text, we shouldn't be thinking of a Bessemer steel plant. We should be thinking hardened metal alloy.
That is the most reasonable approach. And the text actually tracks with the archaeology on the usage pattern. In the early parts of the Book of Mormon, they talk about making tools. But later, metal is almost exclusively described as precious wealth or ornamentation.
Which perfectly matches the archaeological record where metal is mostly found as jewelry or ritual objects.
Correct. It suggests that maybe the surface ores were exhausted or the technology shifted to becoming purely a luxury good.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, that brings us to the next big hurdle. The zoo.
The zoological puzzle. This is always a fun one.
We have lists of animals in the Book of Mormon. Horses, cows, goats, swine. And again, the critics say no horses in America until Columbus brought them.
This brings us to the problem of first encounter naming. Put yourself in the shoes of a Spaniard arriving in the Yucatan in the 1500s. You step off the boat and you see a large, stout animal with a snout. You have never seen this creature before. What do you call it?
I don't know, a pig, I guess.
Exactly. They called the native tapir a pig, or sometimes an ass or a mountain cow. Conversely, the Maya looked at the Spanish horses and had no word for them, so they called the Spanish horse a
On
tuck.
paper. So they just swapped the labels based on what the animal functionally did?
It's called loan shifting. You use a familiar label for a new functional equivalent. So when the Book of Mormon mentions a horse or a cow, we have to ask, is it the species Equus, or is it a label for a large domesticated herbivore?
So what are the candidates? If a cow isn't a Holstein, what is it?
A cow could be a large deer. We know herds of deer were managed and essentially farmed in El Salvador. It could be bison. They ranged as far south as Nicaragua. Or, and this is really fascinating, it could be cameloids.
You mean like llamas and alpacas? I thought those were only in Peru.
We usually think of them in the Andes, but effigy pots of cameloids have actually been found in Costa Rica and figurines in Guatemala. They were likely traded north or lived there in isolated pockets.
And what about goats?
Goats could refer to the brocket deer or other local game that functionally matches what a goat does.
Okay, but what about the horse? Because horse is a pretty specific word and function.
This one is highly controversial. There's actually some physical evidence of true horse bones found in caves in the Yucatan buried 6 feet deep and dating to pre-Spanish times.
Really? So the prehistoric horse might have survived much longer than we thought.
It is entirely possible. But there's also an alternative theory involving deer. There is art in Guatemala and Mexico depicting humans actually riding on the backs of deer.
Riding them, like holding onto the antlers.
Holding onto horns or ears, yes. And in the Quiche Mayan language, the word for deer, which is K, also means horse. So horse might just be the word for deer that is ridden or beast of burden.
That completely changes the mental image of a Nephite cavalry, doesn't it? Riding into battle on a large buck.
It certainly does. We really have to check our modern assumptions at the door. And then there are the mystery beasts. The Jaredite record, which is much older, going back to maybe 2500 BC, mentions curlams and cumims.
Right, which were useful for the food of man and essentially sounded like very large beasts.
And in the exact same breath, they mention elephants.
Elephants in ancient America.
Mastodons and mammoths. We used to think they died out 10,000 years ago. But newer dating shows mastodons in the U.S. as late as 5000 BC and potentially as late as 100 BC in Florida.
Oh, wow. So the Jaredites living in that much earlier window could have actually seen a mastodon.
It is entirely plausible. And the curlams and cumimas were likely Pleistocene megafauna, perhaps the giant sloth or something similar that went extinct during the Jaredite era. The fact that the later Nephite translator didn't translate the names curlam and cumim suggests the animals didn't even exist anymore by his time.
That is a really cool detail. It's like a fossilized word for a fossilized animal.
That is a great way to put it.
Okay, let's pivot from animals to people, specifically the bad guys, the secret combinations.
This is one of the most prominent themes in the text, the rise of secret societies that ultimately overthrow the government.
When I read about this, it sounds remarkably modern. Like the mafia? Or a political coup?
It's the universal blueprint of a secret society. You have promises of power and wealth, you have secret signs and passwords, and a hidden leadership structure. But the question is, does this fit Mesoamerica?
Right, does it?
It fits perfectly. The Mesoamerican equivalent is the Nahualistas.
The Nahualistas, that sounds ominous. Unpack that for us.
These were groups, essentially assassins, who claimed the power of the Nahual or the animal guardian spirit, specifically the jaguar.
Why the jaguar?
The jaguar represented aggression, dominance, and the night. These groups wore jaguar skins, claws, and teeth. They used intense initiation rites and drugs, possibly hashish or local hallucinogens like mushrooms, to induce visions and gain power.
The text mentions secret murders and seducing people to join for the sake of getting gain.
And that is the key link right there. It wasn't just spooky magic, it was highly economic. In the Aztec world, you had the Pachteca.
Pachteca, who were they?
These are the merchant guilds. But think of them as a state within a state. They were incredibly wealthy, very secretive, had their own rituals, and often acted as spies for the Aztec emperor. They traveled everywhere.
So they basically controlled the trade.
They controlled trade and got gain. The Book of Mormon explicitly links the Gadianton robbers to the management of trade and traffic. They weren't just random bandits hiding in the hills. They were an alternative power structure deeply embedded in the economy, exactly like the Pachteca or the powerful merchant classes of Mesoamerica.
It really paints a picture of a society where the government was actually pretty weak and these secret groups could just sweep in and take over.
And that leads us perfectly to the social structure.
Yeah.
The Nephite state, if we can even call it that, was incredibly fragile.
How so? I tend to think of it like a modern nation with borders, an army police.
And that is exactly where the modern reading fails us. Think about it. There was no standing army mentioned in the text. Really only militias raised in times of war. And crucially, there was no police force.
Wait, no police force at all. So who enforced the law?
The only glue holding the society together was shared religion and ritual. When religious dissent happened, when people stopped believing, the government literally crumbled. We see this very clearly in 3 Nephi chapter 7. The government completely collapses. But the society doesn't devolve into a total Mad Max anarchy. It snaps back to a specific shape. Tribes.
Oh, right. It says every man according to his family and his kindred.
Exactly. This matches the Mesoamerican reality perfectly. The fundamental unit wasn't the nation, it was the lineage. Patrilineal descent, tracing your status through your father, was the absolute key for both the ancient Israelites and the Maya.
So when the central government failed, people just fell back on their extended family networks.
Yes, and this explains the city layouts too. The text talks about the people of Zarahemla and the Nephites living in the exact same city, but staying completely distinct. This sounds exactly like the barrio system in ancient Mexican cities.
A barrio system. Explain how that worked back then.
A barrio or a ward was a distinct residential section within a city. But it wasn't just a neighborhood. It had its own internal lineage leadership and its own little government. So you could have two entirely different ethnic groups, sharing a city, trading together, but living under completely different internal rules.
That makes so much sense. It explains how you can have these internal divisions that seem so sharp in the text. It's almost like a city made up of a bunch of really strict homeowners associations.
That is actually a brilliant analogy, yes.
Okay.
And if the central city government fails, your HOA just takes over. It paints a picture of a society that isn't a monolithic empire like Rome, but a collection of lineages and barrios held together by a fragile agreement of faith.
And when that agreement breaks the secret combinations, the Nihilists and the merchant guilds step right into the power vacuum.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean for you listening? We've looked at the metals, the animals, the secret societies, the fragile social structure.
If we step back, what we see is a text that is surprisingly at home in a Mesoamerican setting. It is not a perfect, seamless puzzle by any means. There are absolutely still questions, but the specific details are striking.
It's the nuance, right? It's not just they had metal, it's they treated metal as precious and used alloys that look like gold but are lighter.
Spot on. It's not just they had bad guys. It's they had secret societies linked to trade jaguar symbolism and ritualistic power. It's not just they had animals. It's the confusion of naming functional equivalents in an entirely new world.
It really moves the conversation from this is impossible to this is incredibly complex.
And complexity is the hallmark of real history. Fiction is usually cleaner. Real history is messy. It's filled with lost technologies and strange cultural overlaps that don't always make sense at first glance.
So we want to leave you with this provocative thought today. We talked about the Kurlams and Kumams, these mystery beasts that might have been giant sloths or mastodons, right? And we talked about steel that might actually be a lost metallurgical art of hardening bronze. Here is the question. How many other myths in history, things we dismiss as fairy tales or translation errors, are actually just realities we haven't dug deep enough to find yet?
That's the real question.
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Pleasure as always.